They called it the silence. We called it Tuesday. The first sign was the fishing trawlers. 17 of them, strung out across the Keth Passage like beads on a broken necklace, each one dark and cold and listing. The Vorkai scout ship that found them spent 3 hours circling the debris before its crew worked up the nerve to approach. The hulls were crushed inward, not burned, not disintegrated the way plasma weapons did it, just crushed, as if something enormous had simply pressed through them the way a boot presses through snow. Fleet Commander Usavith reviewed the footage from his chair aboard the ascending Meridian and said nothing for a long time. His adjutant, Keel Third Pronouncer Shasov, waited with the patience of a creature whose species had evolved in tidal caves and learned stillness as survival. Eventually, he said, "The cargo manifests show the vessels were carrying atmospheric processors, colonization-grade equipment." "I can read a manifest," Usavith said. "The humans were seeding the third moon. They've been there for 11 cycles. I know where they were." Another silence. The footage looped. The crushed hulls rotated in the scout ship's lights. "It was one of their own vessels that did this," Shasov said finally. "Not a weapon. The thermal signatures show." "I know what the thermal signatures show." Usaveth stood. He was tall even by Vorkai standards, his neural ridge running from the crown of his skull to the base of his neck like a dorsal fin, lit faintly with the amber of careful thought. "Scramble analysis teams. I want every scrap of sensor data from those wrecks, and contact Governor Pelath on Hessa Station. Tell her the colonization window on Reach 7 is suspended until further notice. She won't like that. She'll like the alternative less." What the analysis teams found over the next 6 days was this. The thing that had destroyed the trawlers was biological. It was warm, it breathed oxygen. It moved at speeds that should have been impossible for something of its mass, and its mass was. The lead analyst used the word catastrophic, then crossed it out and wrote unprecedented, then crossed that out too and simply transmitted the raw numbers without comment. It was an animal, an Earth animal, and it was pregnant, Doctor. Nadia Vasquez-Osi had been studying radiation-accelerated mutation for 11 years, first at the Chernobyl Ecological Research Station, and then, when the grants dried up and the universities started gutting their xenobiology departments in favor of anything with colonial applications in the title, aboard a succession of increasingly underfunded survey ships. She was 41 years old, had not slept more than 5 consecutive hours since her 30s, and owned exactly 2 sets of clothes that weren't technically labeled as work gear. She was also, as of 6 days ago, the only person in documented human history to have correctly predicted the existence of a megafaunal radiation mutation cascade in a species with parthenogenic reproduction. Nobody had listened to her paper. It had been published in a journal with a readership of approximately 300 people, most of whom were also not being listened to. But the paper existed. The math was there. And when Consolidated Colonial Authority pulled her off the survey ship Meridian Cross and dropped her onto a military transport with 12 hours' notice and no explanation, she brought the paper with her in a battered physical folder because she had a feeling she was going to need it. The military transport took her to Hessa Station. Hessa Station was a colonial hub, big and ugly the way functional things are ugly. All pressurized corridors and magnetic docking arms and hydroponics bays that smelled permanently of wet soil. It sat at the L4 point of Reach 7's moon system, which meant it had a clear line of sight to the third moon, Callaway's Reach, where the trawlers had been destroyed. Governor Pelath met her at the dock. Pelath was a compact woman with the particular exhausted confidence of someone who had been managing catastrophes for so long that she had stopped being surprised by them, and she shook Nadia's hand and said, "You wrote the paper on cascade mutation in parthenogenic megafauna 3 years ago." "Nobody." "I read it." Pelath was already walking. Nadia had to hurry to keep up. "I read everything that crosses my desk. It's the job. Your paper says that, given sufficient radiation and sufficient generation time, a parthenogenic species could theoretically develop into a supercolony organism with a single reproductive adult." She paused as at a security door, pressed her palm to the scanner, and looked at Nadia over her shoulder. "How big did your models go?" Nadia thought about the numbers in the paper. The numbers she had actually run, not the ones she had published, because the ones she had actually run seemed at the time too large to be credible. "Big," she said. "The thing that destroyed those trawlers," Pelath said, "is approximately 90 meters long bipedal and appears to be in the process of locating a nesting site on Callaway's Reach. 90 meters, give or take." Nadia followed her through the door. My models went higher than 90 meters. I know, that's why you're here. The Situation Room at Hesse Station was small and smelled like recycled air and someone's cold coffee. There were 6 people in it when Nadia arrived. Peleth, 2 military officers she was introduced to as Colonel Bareth and Lieutenant Commander Foss, a French-accented man named Philippe, who was introduced only as a consultant, and whose eyes moved the way predatory things' eyes move. A civilian communications specialist named D, who was apparently responsible for keeping the station's link to Earth alive through a particularly bad stretch of solar interference, and a young man who was sitting in the corner making notes on a battered tablet, and who turned out to be D's cameraman, a sturdy, cheerful person named Tomas, who had a habit of narrating whatever he was recording under his breath in a whisper. They put Nadia's paper up on the main display. Colonel Bareth studied it with the expression of a man who is doing math and doesn't like the answers. So the offspring, he said. Parthenogenic, Nadia said. The adult reproduces asexually. Each offspring is genetically identical to the parent, and if the same radiation cascade that triggered the adult's development is still active in the environment. She paused. Which it is. We've been running atmospheric processors on Callaway's Reach for 11 cycles. Those processors emit low-level ionizing radiation as a byproduct. We built the mutation in. We just didn't know it. She looked at the display. The offspring will develop faster than the adult did. They'll be smaller, initially. But each one is also capable of parthenogenic reproduction. How many eggs? Bareth said. In a single clutch, the models suggest between 1 and 300. The room was quiet. Each of which, Barath said slowly, is born capable of. Yes, and the time frame for maturation to reproductive age, with the radiation levels on Callaway's Reach. Nadia picked up the tablet Tomas had been using and did the calculation. Showed it to Bareth. Less than a year. Bareth looked at the number. Then he looked at Philippe. Philippe said nothing, but something shifted in his expression. We have to find the nest, Nadia said. Before the eggs hatch. If they hatch and escape the moon, we are having a completely different conversation. The adult is still alive, Foss said. How do we get to the nest with a 90-meter apex predator sitting on it? We don't, Nadia said. We lure it away. The plan, such as it was, involved fish. This was embarrassing to explain to people, but it was the most defensible option. The creature, they had started calling it by the name the surviving fisherman from the first attack, had apparently gasped out before the station's medic sedated him. A word that had been transcribed phonetically, and argued over, and eventually rendered as Gorgia, which everyone immediately shortened to just the animal, because Gorgia sounded like something you'd name a pet. The animal appeared to be piscivorous, massively, voraciously piscivorous. It had stripped 3 of the trawlers clean before crushing them. Philippe's team sourced 60 tons of flash-frozen Atlantic mackerel from a colonial supply depot 2 systems over. It arrived in a refrigerated cargo shuttle that smelled so strongly of fish that Tomas filmed himself gagging in the docking bay for approximately 40 seconds and then said, seriously, into the camera, "This is how humanity ends its first contact. With mackerel." Nadia was on the bridge of the escort frigate, Provisional Courage, when the cargo shuttle made its first pass over Callaway's Reach, trailing a dump line of frozen fish like a grotesque comet tail. The animal found it in 6 minutes. She watched on the thermal scope as something enormous and warm lifted itself from the shadow of a crater ridge and began moving. Even at this scale, a blue shape against the gray-green of the moon's surface. There was something hypnotic about the way it moved. Fluid, efficient, no wasted motion. It was not, she thought, a monster. It was an animal doing what animals did, moving toward food in the only way its body knew how. Then it lunged into the mountain. The mountain turned out to be one of the colonial settlement's terraforming towers. It sheared off at the base. The thermal scope showed the settlement's emergency klaxons firing in Doppler waves. Nadia closed her eyes for a moment. Still moving toward the shuttle, Foss said from the navigation station. Good, Nadia said. Keep the dump line going. Take it wide. Give us a clear path to the settlement. And the nest? The nest, she said, is what I'm going to go find. Philippe went with her. She hadn't asked him to. But when she reached the shuttle bay in her EVA suit, he was already there in his own helmet under one arm, checking the seals with the methodical precision of someone who had done this many times, in places that were significantly more dangerous than a moon, with an apex predator actively distracted by frozen fish on the other side of the terrain. You've done this before, she said. Not a question. Variations of it, he said. The animal changes. The stakes change. The fish, interestingly, are often similar. He picked up his helmet. I will tell you something. The creature, you are right that it is not a monster. It is behaving exactly as its nature dictates. It did not choose to be what it is. That does not change what we have to do, but I find it is useful to hold both things at once. Nadia thought about that for a moment. You're not actually an insurance consultant. I am not, he agreed pleasantly. They took a two-person ground sled down to the settlement at half speed, using the terraforming tower wreckage as cover. The settlement itself was a ghost, evacuated 2 days ago when the animal had first appeared in visual range. The streets were empty. Atmospheric processors hummed. A coffee mug sat on a windowsill, visible through the transparent wall of a hab unit, as if its owner had stepped out for a moment and would be right back. The Colonial Hub was the largest structure in the settlement, a domed building that had originally been designed as a multi-use gathering space and had evolved the way things do in colonial settlements into something that contained a gymnasium, a broadcast studio, a medical bay, a climate-controlled greenhouse, and, apparently, a nest. They found it in the sub-basement. The eggs were the size of office chairs. There were 212 of them, arranged in concentric rings around a central heat source. One of the atmospheric processors, its ionizing output repurposed by whatever instinct the animal possessed into an incubation system of frankly impressive elegance. The eggs pulsed. They were warm. In the light of Nadia's helmet lamp, they had a translucent quality, and she could see movement inside them, faint and rhythmic. They're close, she said, keeping her voice level. How close? She checked the thermal scanner. Days, maybe less. She looked around the room. The broadcast studio was 1 floor up. We need to call in the strike. And if they hatch before we're out, then we run, she said, and we don't stop. The broadcast booth smelled like dust and old upholstery. The equipment was civilian grade, but functional. The settlement had maintained a regular link to the colonial network, and the link was still live. Dee's voice came through on the comm channel, thin with distance and solar interference. But there. I'm going to need you to patch me through to Colonel Barrett, Nadia said. Copy that. He's going to want visual. I have Tomas's camera. She looked at the camera she had borrowed from Tomas over his considerable and vocal objections. He had told her, very seriously, that if she broke it, he would haunt her professionally for the rest of her career. She had taken the camera anyway. Give me 30 seconds. She set up the shot. The camera aimed at her face, the feed from the thermal scanner running in the corner of the display, the sub-basement visible on the security monitor behind her. Then she opened the broadcast channel. This is Dr. Nadia Vasquez-Osi, calling from Callaway's Reach Colonial Hub. I am in the nest. I am looking at 212 eggs that are within days of hatching. The adult animal is currently on the north quarter of the moon, tracking a bait line. If those eggs hatch, the offspring will reach reproductive maturity in under a year, and we are talking about a population cascade that no military asset in this system is equipped to address. She paused. She looked at the thermal scanner. Something on the image caught her attention, a warm shape moving in the sub-basement. She looked at the security monitor. 3 of the eggs had cracked. The hatchlings that emerged were the size of large dogs. They moved low and fast, like something that had been designed by a process that did not care about beauty, only function. They smelled the humans within 30 seconds. Their heads came up. Barath, Nadia said into the camera, her voice not quite steady. I need that airstrike now. We'll be out. Give us. She looked at Philippe. Philippe had already picked up the only chair in the broadcast booth and was holding it the way a person holds something between them and a very fast animal. He held up 4 fingers. 4 minutes, do you copy? The channel crackled. Barrett's voice came through like a signal through a storm. Confirmed. 4 minutes. Get out. Nadia grabbed the camera. She and Philippe ran. The hub's corridors were not designed for speed. They were wide enough, but the emergency lighting had gone to amber, which washed everything in the color of old warnings. And the hatchlings, she could hear them now, a rapid clicking of claws on composite flooring, were faster than they looked. She had been right that they would run. She had been less clear-headed about how terrifying running would be. Philippe was ahead of her by 3 steps, not because he was faster, but because he had the spatial awareness of someone who had spent years making exits from spaces that did not want to let people leave. He took corners without hesitation. He moved like water finding the downhill. She followed him the way you follow the only light in a dark room. They came out of the main entrance with 40 seconds to spare. The ground sled was where they had left it. The sky above Callaway's Reach was the deep bruised purple of a thin atmosphere at the edge of day, and across it, in formation, came 3 colonial defense fighters moving low and fast, their exhaust trails catching the light. Move, Philippe said unnecessarily, because Nadia was already moving. The sled got them 300 meters before the first impact. The pressure wave from the strike hit the sled like a flat hand, shunted it sideways, and Nadia gripped the safety rail with both hands and thought, "We did it. The nest is gone. It's over." Then the ground shook, not from the strike. Something else, something rhythmic, something that was getting closer. The animal had felt the explosions. She understood that later, when she had time to think about it rather than just survive it. The bait line had drawn it north, far enough that the strikes on the hub should have been inaudible at that range. But the seismic signature of 3 colonial defense fighters delivering maximum ordnance was not inaudible. The animal had felt it through the ground, and through whatever system the animal used to sense what mattered and what didn't, the explosions had registered as something happening to the eggs. It came from the north at a speed that should not have been possible. The Provisional Courage had 2 submarine-rated torpedo batteries because it was an escort frigate, and escort frigates in the Reach 7 system had been standardized for aquatic operations on the gas giant's moon before someone remembered that the gas giant's moon had no liquid surface. So the torpedoes were there, unused, and Foss, who had grown up in a naval family and had opinions about not wasting available resources, had kept them armed. The first 2 torpedo strikes hit the animal in the flank, near the base of its left forelimb. It stumbled. It did not fall. It turned toward the Provisional Courage with the full attention of something that had decided, very specifically, that the Provisional Courage was responsible. The frigate's pilot, a 26-year-old named Reyes who had been flying military transports for 4 years and had never once been in a situation remotely like this, said into the comms with preternatural calm, "I'm going to need a better idea." "The bridge network," Nadia said. She was back aboard, breathing hard, still holding Tomas's camera. The colonial road grid. There are 3 suspension-span bridges over the canyon system on the eastern quarter. The cables. Reyes looked at her. "You want to tangle it in suspension cables. The cables are rated for atmospheric processor hauling, 30-ton loads per strand. If we can get it moving fast enough in the right direction." "Can we get it moving fast enough in the right direction?" She held up what was left of the frozen mackerel dumpline canister. It was about a third full. "We can try." The Eastern Canyon system of Callaway's Reach had been one of the terraforming project's most photogenic features. The brochures had called it a natural amphitheater for the new colonial era, which was the kind of language that made Nadia's teeth ache even under normal circumstances. The bridges spanned 3 gaps in the canyon wall, each one a graceful catenary arc of high-tensile cable, built to last because the Colonial Investment Office had at some point actually built something to last. The Provisional Courage made its run low, trailing the bait line with the animal behind it and the first bridge ahead. Nadia was watching from the aft camera feed. The animal moved the way she had studied it moving, fluid and efficient and terrible. But there was something different about it now. The rhythm was off. The torpedoes had done something to its gait, not crippled it. Nothing as clean as that, but there was a hitch, a slight asymmetry, an injury it was compensating for. It was still moving at a speed that outpaced the Provisional Courage on its current heading, but only just. "The first gap in 40 seconds, Reyes said. "Keep it tight," Philippe said from the co-pilot seat. He had apparently decided that the co-pilot seat was where he needed to be, and no one had found a moment to argue with him. "If we bank too early, it anticipates and angles away." "I know how to fly," Reyes said. "I know you know, I am simply." 40 seconds, Nadia said. The Provisional Courage hit the first bridge's airspace and banked hard left, killing thrust for 2 seconds and then burning full on the lateral drives. The bait canister swung wide on its tether. The animal, tracking the heat signature and the fish smell, did not bank. It drove straight through the first bridge. The cables sang. They did not break. The animal hit them at full stride, and the catenary caught it the way a net catches water, not stopping the momentum, but redirecting it, entangling. It drove through 6 meters of cable before the tension equations stopped cooperating, and the whole system, animal, cables, bridge anchor, became a single physics problem. It went down, not quietly, not gracefully. It went down the way things that have never fallen from before go down, with a sound that was less an impact than a redefinition of the local geography, a percussive event that Nadia felt in her molars and her sternum, and somewhere deeper than that, somewhere that had nothing to do with the physics and everything to do with scale. "Barath," Reyes said. Target is down. Eastern Canyon Bridge 3 Alpha. Do you have the targeting solution confirmed, Barath said. Assets inbound. 40 seconds the animal was trying to rise. Nadia could see it on the aft camera. One forelimb pushing against the canyon wall, the long neck lifting, the cables still taut across its torso. It was looking at the provisional courage, with the focused, specific attention of something that was in pain and had decided that pain had an address. For a moment, in the amber light of Calloway's Reach at dawn, it was just an animal. A very large, very injured, very dangerous animal that had never asked to be what it was, that had swum across the dark between systems following whatever instinct a radiation-mutated reptile follows, that had found a warm place with food and built something in the dark, and that had lost it. "I'm sorry," Nadia said. To no one, to the camera maybe, to whatever was watching. The Colonial Defense assets arrived in formation. Afterward, in the silence, Tomas retrieved his camera. He checked the footage with the expression of a man who has recorded something he doesn't entirely know what to do with. Most of it was usable. The nest, the hatchlings, the run through the amber-lit corridors, the bridge. The last few minutes before the strike, Nadia talking to the aft camera, had a quality he'd never quite captured before in 8 years of field work. He watched it back once and then put the camera in his bag without comment. "Good footage?" Nadia asked. "Yeah," he said. "Yeah, it's good footage." Governor Peleth's debrief took 4 hours. It covered the destruction of the nest, the confirmed kill of the adult, the projected environmental impact of the strike on the colonial settlement's terraforming timeline, the question of who was legally responsible for the creation of the Cascade mutation in the first place. The atmospheric processor's radiation specifications were in a footnote of the original colonial contract, buried under 17 layers of contractor sublicensing, and the person who had signed off on them had been retired for 9 years. And the matter of the surviving egg. One egg had been found intact in the ruins of the sub-basement, in a corner that the blast radius hadn't reached. Nadia had carried it out herself, in a thermal case, because leaving it felt wrong, and destroying it felt worse, and bringing it back felt like the only option she could defend when someone eventually asked her why. Peleth looked at the case for a long time. "What do you want to do with it?" "Study it," Nadia said. "Understand it. Figure out how this happened so it doesn't happen again. And if it hatches, then we have a very fast, very hungry animal the size of a large dog, and we deal with it." "That's not a plan." "No," Nadia agreed. "It's a starting point." Philippe was leaving on the next transit shuttle. He stopped by the medical bay, where Nadia was sitting with the thermal case and a cup of coffee that had gone cold, and he sat down across from her and looked at the case for a moment. "The footage Tomas took," he said. "The broadcast, the military record. What about it?" "There will be people who want to see it," he said carefully. "People who will want to know what happened here, and there will be people who would prefer that certain details remain unclear." Nadia looked at him. "The atmospheric processors, the contractors, the radiation specifications, among other things. And you represent." "I represent," he said, "an interest in making sure the right lessons are learned." He paused. "Usually that requires removing sums from the record. In this case, I am not certain that is true." He stood. "I will think about it on the transit." He left. She looked at the thermal case. Inside it, something shifted against the shell. The official report released 6 weeks later described the Calloway's Reach incident as a radiation-catalyzed megafaunal emergence event and recommended a full review of atmospheric processor specifications across all colonial terraforming contracts. It noted the contributions of Dr. Nadia Vasquez OC and identified her paper, published 3 years prior, as providing the primary theoretical framework for understanding the cascade mutation mechanism. It did not mention Philippe by name. It referred to him as a specialist consultant. It mentioned the nest. It mentioned the eggs. It mentioned, in a single line, that one egg had been recovered and was under study. The footage Tomas had taken was included in full. The broadcast from the Colonial Hub's control room, Nadia's voice steady over the sound of claws on composite flooring, asking for the strike with 40 seconds to spare. That was included too. Barath had argued against it. Peleth had overruled him. "People need to see this," she said. "Not the monster. The people." The report circulated through the colonial network, and then, inevitably, filtered back to Earth and out along the settlement lines and eventually to the Vorkai monitoring stations that had been watching the Reach 7 system since the trawlers were destroyed. Fleet Commander Usaveth read it 3 times. He had been watching human activity in the Reach 7 system for 2 years, building a profile. They were, in his assessment, a species of moderate technological development and immoderate stubbornness. The kind of civilization that made up for gaps in capability with an almost irrational willingness to improvise. They argued with each other constantly. They had three competing colonial administrative frameworks operating simultaneously in this system alone, each with slightly different rules about what counted as a valid contract. Their military communications were a patchwork of different encoding standards that required three translators and a lot of patience. They had found a 90-meter radiation-mutated apex predator nesting in their settlement, identified the mechanism of its reproduction, located the nest in the ruins of a structure it had partially destroyed, broadcast a live warning from inside that structure while the eggs were hatching around them, run out with 40 seconds to spare, improvised a cable trap using bridge infrastructure, and called in an airstrike. From start to finish, 72 hours, Shasov was watching him read. Sir, I know the egg they recovered. I know if it hatches and if the environment continues to. I know, Shasov. Yusevith set the report down. His neural ridge had gone to blue, which was a color his subordinates associated with decisions being made at a depth that didn't surface quickly. He stood and looked out the observation port at Reach 7's moon system, at the distant bright point that was Hessa Station, at the even more distant faint smear that was Calloway's Reach, half visible in the gas giant's shadow. Contact the diplomatic intercession office, he said. Not military, diplomatic. Shasov blinked. We are opening contact with the humans? We are opening contact with the humans. He paused. Careful. What changed? Yusevith considered the question. The footage had circulated now. The amber corridors, the cracked eggs, the woman with the borrowed camera, the voice asking for the airstrike with the hatchlings already moving in the sub-basement below, the animal going down in the canyon, the thermal case in the medical bay. What changed? I was watching them to see if they were dangerous, he said. I was asking the wrong question. He turned from the window. A species that can build something it is afraid of, recognize the danger, name it correctly, and make the call anyway. That is not a species you watch. That is a species you talk to. He paused again, and something shifted in his posture that Shasov had learned, over 12 years of service, to read as the rare thing it was, genuine uncertainty. Very carefully, he said. The egg hatched on a Tuesday. Nadia was in the lab, writing up the latest spectrographic analysis, when the monitoring system flagged a temperature change in the thermal case. She put down the spectrograph. She walked to the case. She opened it. The animal inside was, as she had predicted, the size of a large dog. It blinked at her with eyes that were yellow and slit-pupiled and sharp with a kind of attention that had no word for her in its vocabulary, and no vocabulary for the concept of her, and it made a sound. Not a roar, not yet. Just a low vibration in the air between them. An inquiry. Yeah, she said. I don't know either. She went and got it fish. Tomas was in the doorway, camera up, recording, because Tomas was always recording. He watched her set the food down. He watched the small animal eat with the serious efficiency of something that knew exactly what it was for. You have a name for it, he asked. I'm thinking, she said. Gorgia Jr., he suggested. Classic. Evocative. Rolls off the tongue. I'll think of something. Outside the station, Reach 7's moon system turned in the gas giant's shadow, and the stars held their positions, and somewhere in the dark between them, a Vorkai diplomatic shuttle was making calculus about distance and approach vectors, and the always complicated question of what to say first when you were meeting a species you had underestimated. Nadia watched the animal eat. It finished, looked up at her, made the inquiry sound again. I know, she said. Me too. She reached into the case and turned off the thermal coil. It didn't need it anymore. The station was warm enough. And the animal, for the first time in its short life, felt the ambient temperature of a human-built space and found it satisfactory. Small victories. That's where humanity lives, she had written once. In a paper that 300 people read and one governor remembered. Not in the big moments, in the Tuesday ones. In the fish and the borrowed camera and the 40 seconds to spare. In the decision to carry the egg out rather than leave it, because leaving it felt wrong. She looked at the animal. The animal looked back at her. Okay, she said. Let's figure out what you are.